Breaking news, Sony launched the top secret Sony Alpha 1, their top-end camera and the most expensive full-frame mirrorless camera ever. It is designed to take on and defeat the amazing Canon R5, but it doesn't beat it in every way. I'm going to go through all those details. I've had a private conference with Sony, so I know a little bit more than the rest of y'all. But first, a word from our sponsor, Squarespace. You know, I've had my email address, tony@northrup.org, for more than 20 years. Everybody else has been hopping from like AOL and Hotmail to Gmail and something else in the future, no doubt. But I have my own domain name, northrup.org. You should get your own domain name and your own web presence outside of social media, so you have some stability, because social media, domain names, that's all unstable because you don't own it. It's not always going to be free probably, but Squarespace is reliable, beautiful, and it reflects your own personal sense of style. So check it out at squarespace.com/Tony. 14-day free trial. You can decide if you love it. You can get your own domain name with the coupon code Tony and you'll get 10% off. Thank you, Squarespace. First, a little mini rant. What is up with Sony's naming scheme? Like, first they had the A7, that was their mid-range, and then the A9 was the high-end, and now the top high-end is A1. I think they want professional buyers to understand that the Alpha 1 competes directly with the Canon 1DX, because that is the market that they're going for. And you'll see that in the price point, which is $6,500, like the exact same price as the 1DX. That's 8,500 Canadian dollars, and it's going to be launched in March of 2021. It is a bigger body, better weather sealing, a tilt screen, but not a flip screen, and a new top dial that they didn't really talk about. It takes 50 megapixel files at 30 frames per second, which has never been done before. It will do that with AFC tracking in no viewfinder blackout, but I am curious to try this out in the real world, so subscribe to see our upcoming real world review. The buffer will last for about 165 JPEGs, writing out to CF Express Type A cards, the faster card option, which still means you really only get like 5 seconds of shooting, but the buffer should clear much, much faster than it does on your A9 or your A7R4 because of the faster throughput. Now, you have the option to use SD cards, but they're going to be a little bit slower, even though they're UHS-2. It doesn't come anywhere near the speed of the CF Express Type A cards, which are still hard to find. It can shoot 20 frames per second, like full RAW in normal mode, but it seems like the 30 frames per second mode is not particularly limited and will still be really useful to wildlife and sports photographers. It supports Sony's pixel shift mode, which shifts the sensor and takes up to 16 frames of a single still subject, providing full red, blue, green color information for 200 pixels. In my experience using this on the Sony A7R4, it is useful in only a very narrow set of scenarios. It's not useful for any kind of handheld subject. You're going to be at a heavy tripod. I don't even find it useful for architectural or landscape photography because I've never had a successful set of shots anywhere except in my concrete floor basement. If I'm even on the first floor of my house, the just general movement of the earth and cars going past and people walking around seems to screw up every single shot. So it is useful perhaps for product photographers, for fine art reproductions in very controlled conditions. Or maybe the improved shutter on this and improved stability will actually make it more useful. We'll have to test it to find out. Here's something that seems like a trivial point, but is actually a big deal to my wife and myself. The shutter closes when you turn the camera off, which will hopefully keep some of the dust off the sensor. This has been a continual problem on our other Sony cameras, except for the Sony A9 Mark II. The rolling shutter is supposed to be 1.5 times less than the Sony A9. Rolling shutter is the sort of distortion that you get where things seem to slant to the side, either when you're panning rapidly or a subject is moving quickly across the frame. I never detected any rolling shutter in the Sony A9 series, so the fact that it's better is good and will just give you some additional confidence. We'll have to test it to see how it compares to the R5. They're advertising flicker-free shooting with the electronic shutter. This has been a really big deal because with any existing camera using the electronic silent shutter under artificial lights like these at high shutter speeds, you get banding. and it can be picture ruining. And in fact, I experienced some of that banding shooting professional sports with a Sony A9 Mark II, and it was enough that I really felt like I could not recommend it to professional shooters who were going to be regularly shooting in a variety of different situations, because you might spend a whole game shooting and only after the game realize that a large portion of your shots were kind of ruined by this banding. Now, I think this is going to fix it, but at the same time, it's one of those things that I'll really have to test when I get it in my own hands, which I hope should be soon. Apparently, it's able to sense whether there are 120 or 100 hertz lights in the room. And to give you some background, in the US we use 120 hertz, which is like 120 times a second. Lights actually flicker, but your eyes can't perceive this because your brain just doesn't work quite as fast as a camera does. At slower shutter speeds, you don't notice this, but at really fast shutter speeds, you can actually see multiple pulses as it goes down the frame, creating this ugly picture ruining banding. Just like the Sony A9 Mark II, it has the ability to specify very specific high shutter speeds. So not just like 1/2000ths, 1/4000ths, but you can dial in little fractions that help you match it to a multiple of whatever the pulsing is for the current lights. And I have used this to reduce the banding effects, but it's a very slow manual process. So I hope this sort of automatic process works much better. For the first time I know of in any electronic shutter camera, you can use the flash with the electronic shutter. This was literally a problem last night as Chelsea and I were taking studio pictures with our Canon R5. Chelsea had just left the electronic shutter on because she was shooting at 20 frames per second with wildlife, brought it into the studio, and suddenly the flash wasn't firing, and it's because she forgot to put it back into mechanical shutter mode. I don't know why they don't switch automatically, but they don't. With the Sony A1, you'll be able to use the flash up to a sync speed of 1/200th of a second when shooting silently with the electronic shutter. Now, silent shutter is probably not going to be that useful when you're shooting with the flash because after all, the flash itself makes noise and is not discrete, but at least if you forget to change it, it shouldn't be as big of a deal. The sync speed with a mechanical shutter is 1/400th of a second, and that's a pretty big deal because most cameras have a sync speed of 1/250th of a second, 1/320th of a second. And if you're a studio photographer, a portrait photographer, this means that the faster shutter speed allows you to better kill the ambient light. So you can have more lights on in your studio and have that light disappear when you take a photo. So you could be in a well-lit room and still take photos with a black background. Now, modern flashes have the ability to do high-speed sync. So this hasn't been as big of a deal as it used to, but the high-speed sync uses more flash power and generally slows down the power between pulses. So this will be a nice to have for portrait and studio photographers, or for photographers out in the field shooting under full sun who need to kill the sun and don't want to have to use high-speed sync. This has the new menu system from the Sony A7S III, which is much improved over the other Sony cameras. The menu system has been a big complaint of all the Sony cameras, and this new menu system does not fix all the problems. It still uses a lot of the same weird naming, but it is improved, and at least you can touch it to interact with it. It has the same A7S Mark III viewfinder, which is absolutely amazing. 9.44 million quad XGA, and it's just higher resolution and so much bigger. And it will function at 240 hertz. So basically it's refreshing that screen 240 times a second, which should just give you extremely fluid motion. I don't know that the human eye would be able to really perceive much over 120 frames per second, but smoother's always better, right? A big question remains, how much viewfinder lag is there while shooting? Because a lot of cameras that I've shot with don't have much lag at all when you're just looking through it. But once you hold down that shutter and you're shooting at the max frame rate, that lag increases. I've measured this, and I've also noticed its effect in the real world, tracking fast-moving subjects like a flying bird or a professional athlete. It's meant that I miss shots. And it also has meant that I continue to recommend DSLRs with optical viewfinders for action shooters rather than advancing to the latest technology. So will this new viewfinder technology finally allow action shooters like us to switch to mirrorless? Sony has added a feature, proper bird and animal IAF. My wife Chelsea and I were so impressed with the Canon R5's IAF that, well, my wife switched to Canon from Sony for it. So I don't know, maybe she'll want to switch back now. It looks great in their demonstrations, but this is something that you just have to test in the real world with a 600mm lens, and I will do that in our upcoming review. Their IAF for humans has also been improved, and indeed the video shows that it seems to work very smoothly and acquires very, very quickly. And the autofocus on it will work up to f22. A lot of the times the tracking AF degrades when you're using higher f-stop numbers because less and less light is coming in, but they've optimized it so that you can shut the aperture down to a tiny little hole, which allows you to use slower shutter speeds. And why would you want to track and be at f22? That's not how most sports photographers work. Well, it is actually really useful if you want to drag the shutter, follow a panning subject, and nicely blur the background without having to use an ND filter. So you should now be able to autofocus in those scenarios. Connectivity has been a big deal on this camera. They have also heard our complaints and said, okay, we're going to give you ways to get those files off the camera without having to pull out your memory card like it's a floppy disk in 1985. They're providing gigabit Ethernet, which is just a wired network cable like might come out of your desktop computer. It's not 10 gig Ethernet, which I have on my laptop. It's gigabit Ethernet, but it's still pretty fast, and Ethernet cables can be super long and flexible. So if you're on the sidelines of a pro sports game, look at those photographers. They will probably have an Ethernet cable coming out of their camera in order to get it to the editor, in order to get it online as fast as possible. So you'll be able to use that existing workflow. But they've also upgraded the Wi-Fi in it to 802.11ac with 2 antenna, multiple in, multiple out, just for generally faster bit rates. It is not Wi-Fi 6. So it's still not state of the art, and we'll actually have to test it to see what the throughput will be, real world stuff. The USB-C has been upgraded to USB 3.2 at 10 gigabits per second. So if you're tethering, these 50 megapixel files will move through much, much quicker. And when we shoot in the studio tethered, I really like to see the shot as quickly as possible after I take it. It makes the whole workflow go because you're frequently shooting, looking at it on the big tethered screen, making some adjustments, reshooting, and you want it to appear just instantly, and it should be a little more instant. You can tether it to just about any type of smartphone through this USB-C connection, and they demonstrated the Sony Xperia, but talking to them, I found out that it should work with any smartphone, including an iPhone. But again, things can sometimes break down in the real world, so we'll have to test this. It has FTP, the old file transfer protocol that dates back to the 70s, for moving files from the camera to a server on the internet or on your local network. And if you don't know what an FTP server is, don't worry, most people don't. I'm an old networking guy, so I do have my own FTP server, and I have it as a landing place for files that I take on the internal network. You'll be able to do that, and in fact, I'll make a video showing you how to set up an FTP server. You could plug your smartphone into it and then wirelessly upload it over the internet to an FTP server that you host. So you could actually be in the field with a USB-C cable and have that cellular connection. It is disappointing they didn't go ahead and build that cellular technology into the camera itself. Saving something for the next generation, I guess. The new Xperia Pro, I think also announced today, will tether and work as an HDMI monitor in proper 4K. So it's actually going to be a really high resolution HDMI monitor that's significantly smaller than something like the Ninja 5 that we use as an HDMI monitor now. And you'll be able to live stream the video through the Xperia. So finally, Sony Imaging is working with Sony's mobile devices to create something that is sort of greater than the sum of the parts. And I'm excited to see that partnership and see how it works in the real world. For file formats, they've expanded it a bit. Like the A7S III, they're providing us 10-bit HEIF files. HEIF is like a new version of JPEG. It's a more efficient file format, so you can get similar image quality with smaller sizes, but you'll actually also get better image quality. It also offers lossless compressed RAW, which was not previously available. So you'll be able to get smaller RAW file sizes without losing any detail at all. Big complaint previously was that if you didn't want the full uncompressed RAW, you had to go to lossy compressed RAW, and you would lose a little bit of quality, especially in like astrophotography scenarios. So consider that addressed. A lot of people say, I don't want a 50 megapixel camera. Those files are too big. My editors just want 20 megapixel files. That's just fine. To address that concern, Sony is providing scaling built into the Sony A1. So those 50 megapixel RAW files can be scaled down to 21 megapixel medium-sized JPEG files, but it will not produce scaled down RAW files like, say, the Nikon D850 does. You can also create 21 megapixel files with a 1.5 times crop. So think of that as an internal teleconverter for sports and wildlife scenarios where you need to shoot a little bit further away. It has sensor stabilization, as all modern mirrorless cameras do, up to 5.5 stops. So that's an improvement over previous Sony cameras. Does not compare to the Canon R5, which we find like real world 8 stops. But it's better, and again, the kind of thing we have to test in the real world. It's also supposed to automatically detect handheld video and give you an optimized stabilization algorithm that looks more gimbal-like. And their sample videos do show that it looks pretty natural. Let's talk more about the video capabilities. It shoots at 8K and 30 frames per second, just like the Canon R5, right? And it's actually scaling down a little bit, but shooting full width. This is not cinema DCI 8K, but it's like regular standard 16:9 8K. It will shoot at 4K at 120 frames per second with a little bit of a crop. It will record 8K or 4K 120 officially at 30-minute recordings, but sort of unofficially, the Sony rep I was talking to said he managed to record for more than an hour. It does have this sophisticated heat dissipation system, so overheating should be far less of a concern than it is on the Canon R5. Even though, I gotta say, with the Canon R5's latest firmware, we have not had any overheating problems, but we also don't do long 8K recordings, so we'll put those side by side. The reason I shoot my out and about videos on a Sony a7S III instead of a Canon is that it has a digital audio mic connection, which means I do not have to run any cables separately to the camera. The microphone attaches directly through the hot shoe, and the camera provides battery power to the mic. So there's no extra batteries to fail, no cable to come loose, nothing to get snagged, and it makes my entire vlogging workflow much, much easier. The A1 also provides a full-sized HDMI port, which I really appreciate because mini and micro HDMI are simply unreliable. They just tend to come loose. It provides 10-bit in S-Log 3, and S-Log is just a way to cram extra dynamic range into a compressed file format. It's only useful for people who are actually doing grading, people who go in and adjust the color and saturation and black and white points of their video. So if you're a serious video editor, you might use this. S-Log basically provides what RAW files do to still images in providing extra grading latitude for dynamic range, but they don't provide internal RAW. You can record RAW, 16-bit RAW through the HDMI port, but that means you're going to need an external recorder. Let's compare the Sony A1 to the Canon R5. First of all, price. Canon wins big here. The Canon R5 is $3,900. When that came out, we were like, whew, that's a lot of money. Well, brace yourself for the Sony Alpha 1 at $6,500. That's a lot, but that is the same price as the Canon 1DX Mark III DSLR. So it's not a mirrorless camera. It doesn't, I think it shoots at 16 frames per second instead of 30 frames per second. So, and it's only 20 megapixels as opposed to 50 megapixels. So it feels like with the Sony A1, at least on a feature by feature basis, you're getting much, much more for your money. The megapixels is a little bit more than the R5, but I promise you're never going to see a difference in sharpness between 45 and 50 megapixels. But the R5 shoots at 20 frames per second, which blew us away just a couple of months ago. But still, 50% more frames per second come out of the Sony A1. So that could be a pretty big difference for people who shoot wildlife and sports, as do we, because that just means you're going to have more options. And ultimately, when shooting at that high frame rate, you're going to be able to pick out a more perfect split second. Let's talk about how these two cameras compare for video. The Canon R5 and the Sony A1 both shoot 8K at 30 frames per second. The Canon R5 has the option to record 8K at 30 frames per second RAW internally, but it will not output RAW 8K video. The Sony A1 will not record RAW 8K internally, but it will output it. The Sony A1 will definitely record 8K video for longer without the overheating concerns of the R5, but we'll have to test that to be sure. They both record at 4K at 120 frames per second. The A1 has a tilt screen and the R5 has a flip screen. And if you are only behind the camera, then you're probably going to prefer the tilt screen. If you're like us, where you're a hybrid shooter, you're taking stills, maybe you're recording a behind the scenes video for your portrait client, or you're putting yourself in the video for the sake of your social media, your Instagram, your Facebook, things that are really important to so many photographers now, that flip screen becomes really useful because you can see yourself and you can change the camera settings by touching the flip screen, something you can't do on an external monitor. And so for us hybrid shooters, those of us who want one camera that can do it all, the R5 will continue to be the better option. But for specialized shooters who are only ever behind the camera and never make themselves part of the story, the A1 might be a little bit of a better option. The R5 offers more IBIS, more handheld shooting ability. And we find this incredibly useful and really aids in the versatility because you can even slap an ND filter on there and take handheld shots at a second, or I've even done 2 seconds on an R5. So you can get long shutter speed, flowing water shots as a landscape photographer without having to bring a tripod. Really helps out. You're not going to get nearly as long a shutter on the A1, but we'll test it to be sure. The R5 requires a mic cable, and the microphones are always going to be analog. With the A1, you can get digital mics. You can get digital shotgun mics, digital lav mics like I'm using here, wirelessly, and the A1 will record video to both card slots. So if you have a card failure on the A1, you're fine. You pop the card out and you use the backup. This has already happened to us on the Sony A7S Mark III that we record on the go with brand new professional Sony CF Express Type A cards. I had a file on my primary card corrupted. I don't know why it got corrupted, but it was ruined and it would have screwed up our entire day of shooting. I just popped out the second card and I was able to get that file from there. With the Canon R5, you just lose a day of shooting. The Sony A1 and Canon R5 both offer 802.11ac. Again, not the fastest, newest Wi-Fi, but it's good. The A1 also has a gigabit Ethernet port, which the R5 lacks. It'll do USB cell tethering, which I don't think the R5 will do. They both do FTP transfers, but the Canon R5 also will upload files directly to image.canon, which is this service that takes your files temporarily and then moves them to your computer, your Google Drive, or your Lightroom Creative Cloud, so they can actually automatically appear in your Lightroom catalog with the previews and stuff all rendered by the time you sit back down. Sony still doesn't offer something like that, though you might be able to hack something together using the FTP service if you're a technically savvy person. In the comments down below, I'd like to hear what you think of the Sony A1. Are you going to buy one? Are you going to rent one? Are you going to pick it over the Canon R5? And are you subscribing so that you can see our full review? Thanks to our sponsor, Squarespace, which provides you with an amazing web presence, a customized domain, something better than social media. Social media can get taken away. Social media is constantly crowded with more and more ads. Social media will suddenly change the style and look of your entire page. You should control your web presence by signing up at squarespace.com/Tony. Get a 14-day free trial. I promise you'll love it, but if you don't, there's no risk. Once you sign up, use the coupon code Tony for 10% off. Thank you, Squarespace, and don't forget to check out Northrup.photo, where we have a Valentine's Day sale going on, up to 50% off of our video training, as well as our hats, our masks, our video books, our Lightroom presets. Just check it out, no coupon code required. Thanks and bye.